Welcome. Today you will complete a 30-minute webinar that aims to educate university students and new professionals on a variety of important topics related to child sexual abuse. Educating adults on issues related to child sexual abuse is a necessary and essential step in keeping children safe. Additionally, training can help adults to respond to children in a supportive and protective manner when sexual abuse is disclosed. Please click the arrow to go to the next slide. Some might find the discussion of this topic upsetting. If you feel distressed after completing this study and would like assistance, please contact the following providers. Counseling and Psychological Services is a mental health clinic for students located on UNL's campus. The Psychological Consultation Center is a mental health clinic for community members, including students, located on UNL's campus. Finally, Voices of Hope is a service provider for those who have experienced relationship violence, sexual assault, and related forms of abuse. You can reach Voices of Hope staff on their office line or through a 24-hour crisis line. You can also find links to these providers by clicking the word Resources located near the upper right part of the screen. Please click the arrow to go to the next slide. The primary purpose of this training is to educate students and new professionals from an array of disciplines to increase their competence in working with children and families who have experienced sexual abuse. The following information is broad enough that professionals from many disciplines, as well as any adult, can apply it when working and interacting with children and families. However, the information provided is not intended to be comprehensive and will not cover all aspects related to child sexual abuse. For example, the current training is not aiming to help identify signs of undisclosed abuse, discuss offenders, learn how to conduct therapy with survivors, or even necessarily prevent abuse from occurring. While these topics are invaluable for all adults to understand, they are outside of the limited scope of the brief training provided today. Other online and in-person resources are available if you are interested. Overall, equipped with proper training, including the information provided today, it is our belief that professionals interacting with survivors of child sexual abuse in any capacity have the opportunity to support children and be a positive part of their recovery. There are many benefits to completing this training, but you may ask yourself, does this training really apply to me? The answer is yes, this training applies to everyone. If you plan to work in a job, volunteer position, or practicum placement with youth, with adults who are parents to youth, or with adults who may have experienced abuse as a child, this information applies to you. Training may especially benefit those who plan to go into a mental health, social work, psychology, or helping profession, such as mental health practitioners, social workers, or counseling school and clinical psychologists, as well as anyone working in a religious or faith-based organization, those who plan to go into a medical profession, such as nurses, physicians, physician's assistants, and other general health professionals, those who plan to go into education, such as teachers and childcare workers, those who plan to go into law enforcement, as well as those in a legal profession, such as attorneys, paralegals, or legal aides. This training may also benefit those from other professionals not described here. Additionally, outside of the mentioned professions above, many people at some point in their lives will encounter children, whether it be their own children, friends' children's, neighbor, or family members. Therefore, even if you do not plan to go into any of these professions, the following information could be beneficial for you and applied in non-professional settings. To reach the goal of providing information to improve competence of those who encounter and work with sexual abuse survivors, you will receive information on the definition and prevalence of child sexual abuse, the vast array of outcomes associated with victimization, the general factors related to resiliency, meaning the factors which associate with better outcomes for survivors. Finally, we will cover the common responses people have to child sexual abuse disclosures and how people's responses, such as blaming the victim or believing the victim, may influence outcomes. Throughout this training, it is our goal to promote and empower all adults and all professionals to be a positive part of survivors' recovery. This means that with this knowledge, you can increase resiliency and encourage continued recovery in those who have experienced sexual abuse. Defining child sexual abuse is not always straightforward, as there are many different definitions used across states and organizations, as well as in research and clinical endeavors. Broadly, child sexual abuse can be defined as any inappropriate interaction of a sexual nature between an adult and a child. Some definitions also include inappropriate sexual interactions between minors when one minor is exerting power over the other. Sexual abuse includes contact acts, such as fondling, as well as non-contact acts, such as being shown pornography. Again, exact definitions of child sexual abuse vary. The federal government lays a minimum foundation for the legal definition described on the screen. Then each state may build upon this federal definition, including descriptions of specific sexually abusive acts, the age of consent, and the age difference requirements between the victim and the offender. Thus, definitions differ from state to state. For example, in Nebraska, the age of consent is 16. Child sexual abuse is a serious crime, and precise legal definitions help to determine potential criminal charges for the offender. Child sexual abuse affects youth of all ages, genders, ethnicities, backgrounds, cultures, and socioeconomic circumstances. The actual prevalence of child sexual abuse is unknown. Many children never come forward, and many children wait prolonged periods of time before disclosing. Reports from different studies can produce vastly different prevalence rates, yet currently it's estimated that about 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before they turn 18. And when broken down by gender, about 1 in 7 girls and 1 in 25 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. These numbers only reflect contact offenses. Another prevalence rate that is commonly described is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men report that they were sexually abused as children. This prevalence rate comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. While these prevalence rates vary, they tell us that child sexual abuse is a common occurrence. Nebraska state law requires any person who has reasonable cause to believe a child has been abused or neglected to report the information to law enforcement or to the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, hotline. This includes if a person observes conditions that reasonably would result in child abuse or neglect. Every adult in Nebraska is a mandated reporter of child abuse. The Nebraska Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline is 1-800-652-1999. Exposure to sexual abuse in childhood is associated with a vast array of outcomes. Understanding the consequences associated with sexual abuse allows professionals to better identify symptoms, have a more comprehensive understanding of the impact of sexual abuse, and interact with children in an empathetic and supportive manner. Children who are sexually abused may be at risk for experiencing mental health, behavioral, social, and physical health problems. Mental health symptoms and disorders may include depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Symptoms of PTSD include re-experiencing the abuse through thoughts or nightmares, avoiding thoughts or experiences associated with the abuse, negative mood or thoughts due to the abuse, and increased reactivity due to the abuse. Other mental health symptoms may include suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior, self-harming behavior, and problems with self-esteem. Some children may also engage in sexual behavior problems, developmentally inappropriate sexual behaviors, risky sexual behaviors such as unprotected sex, and having more sexual partners. An engagement in risky sexual behaviors can associate with contracting sexually transmitted infections and having an unintended pregnancy. Children are also at risk for experiencing conduct or behavioral problems and aggression, substance use and abuse, academic problems, and relationship problems. Victimization is also associated with poor health-related quality of life because sexual abuse can have negative health and neurobiological outcomes. Finally, children are at increased risk for experiencing subsequent sexual victimization, termed re-victimization, in child and adulthood. Child sexual abuse is unquestionably a momentous public health problem, and combating the sexual abuse of children should be a global priority. Despite the potential risk for developing significant and long-lasting problems, some children are highly resilient and do not face substantial problems following sexual abuse. For example, some children only experience limited short-term problems that later go away, and some youth do not experience any significant negative outcomes and quickly return to pre-abuse functioning. Specifically, studies show that between 10 and 53% of survivors present with no significant symptoms. Additionally, among those who experience clinical problems, Studies have found that many children's symptoms decrease over time, and most children see improvement in their symptoms when measured 12 and 18 months later. Although this is not to say that some children's symptoms do not worsen over time. If a child does not present with significant symptoms, the provision of services and mental health treatment can be beneficial. These services may focus on providing education to the child and family to prevent re-victimization in the future. Moreover, it is possible for some children to not experience immediate negative outcomes at first but develop them later. Thus, timely treatment, even with asymptomatic children, may act to enhance coping and further reduce potential negative consequences. Overall, there is a large range of outcomes for children who experience sexual abuse, and there is no one pattern of symptoms exhibited by victims. Reactions to traumatic events can vary significantly depending on the individual. This makes survivors of child sexual abuse a diverse group. Thus, it is impossible to tell if children have experienced sexual abuse by their demeanor. So why do some kids experience certain negative consequences and some don't? Why does one person develop PTSD while another develops academic problems? Or why does one person develop depression, anxiety, and substance abuse while another does not develop any significant symptoms? How sexual abuse affects a child depends on numerous factors which interact with one another. These include risk and protective factors relating to the abuse, the child, the family, and the environment, which will be described in detail in the next slides. Despite these clues as to why abuse impacts children differently, it can be difficult to predict in what ways sexual abuse will impact an individual child because these factors are not definite, certain, or fixed, and the combination of co-occurring risk and protective factors is infinite. We will now focus on discussing the factors which associate with better outcomes in children who have experienced sexual abuse. Protective factors are individual, family, and environmental characteristics that modify a child's response to an adverse life event, such as sexual abuse, which typically associates with negative outcomes. These protective factors are invaluable for adults and professionals to understand because they can more easily identify those protective factors in children and families, encourage the utilization of protective factors once identified, and strengthen or build up those factors when working with children and families. The first and most studied protective factor is parental or caregiver support. Parental support has been consistently linked with children's adjustment following sexual abuse. Children who feel supported and understood by their parents and caregivers are more likely to be resilient and have better outcomes. Having someone to talk with and confide in, as well as feeling cared for, has also been shown to be important. This can include either family members, other supportive adults in the community, and peer-aged friends. Other protective factors relating to the family include positive parenting practices, family connectedness, parent education and socioeconomic status, stability in housing and in the family home, and low rates of other adverse events within the family. Improving family support and other variables relating to the family could decrease negative consequences associated with child sexual abuse. Another factor relating to better outcomes is engagement in mental health treatment to process emotions and address the effects of sexual abuse. Research and clinical efforts are dedicated to helping children following sexual victimization, and there are effective mental health treatments for survivors of child sexual abuse. Effective mental health treatment, such as individual or group therapy and counseling, allows children to identify and process their emotions, learn adaptive coping strategies, discuss and improve family relationships, learn developmentally appropriate sexual education, gather information on safe and unsafe touches in personal space, and acquire skills to prevent re-victimization. Treatment should also focus on empowering youth, decreasing negative effects of sexual abuse, and strengthening and teaching the factors that associate with positive outcomes. For example, the following protective factors have been linked to resilient outcomes and can be strengthened or taught in therapy: understanding and managing emotions, using adaptive coping skills, reducing stigma, increasing interpersonal and emotional competence, improving self-esteem, shaping attribution style, including not blaming themselves and viewing the abuse as something that does not have to permeate all areas of life, which can improve optimism and hope, giving meaning to their story, increasing engagement in clubs, cultural or leisure activities, and religious organizations when appropriate, valuing individual spirituality, and increasing empowerment and control. Many services with children who have been sexually abused include the child's non-offending parents or caregivers. Non-offending parents and caregivers are adults who did not perpetrate the abuse. Evidence shows that if a parent receives therapy or counseling following their child's sexual abuse disclosure, it can have positive benefits for the parent as well as the child. This makes sense given the significant importance family support has on improving child outcomes. Additionally, parents can identify and process their own emotions about the abuse, learn coping strategies, acquire skills in parenting, communication, and problem solving, which all can improve outcomes for the parent and child. Other, often less studied factors have also shown to associate with children having better outcomes following sexual abuse. Child-related factors include having higher levels of intelligence, reserved, controlled, and rational personal qualities, and positive school or educational experiences. These include good relationships with teachers, making realistic educational plans for the future, showing more school engagement, having positive feelings towards school, and being enrolled in a safe school. Aspects relating to the abuse that occurred can also influence outcomes. This includes the type, severity, frequency, duration, use of force, age when abuse occurred, and relationship to the offender. Of note, there are numerous other protective factors reported in the literature. Just as previously discussed that protective factors are linked with child adjustment, people's immediate and ongoing responses to a child's disclosure or to the news of child sexual abuse can influence victim outcomes. For example, it is common for adults and parents to be highly confused, shocked, angry, sad, and even be in denial that the sexual abuse occurred. These potentially strong emotions may lead to questions such as, did the abuse really happen? Could the accused offender really have done this? Whose fault is it? Did my child do something to provoke the abuse? Is it my fault as a trusted adult in the child's life? Why didn't the child come forward sooner? And will the child ever be the same? Processing these questions is important, and the way an adult ultimately answers these questions can have significant implications for the victim's recovery because it can influence how the adult treats the child. Thus, next we will provide you with information on why children do not tell right away, why children should be believed, why children and non-offending parents should not be blamed, why, with appropriate support and treatment, children can be resilient, and how certain responses to abuse can be detrimental to child recovery. It's important to understand that the majority of children do not immediately tell an adult after they experience sexual abuse. In fact, many children wait prolonged periods of time and some never tell. There are many reasons why some children don't tell about sexual abuse. They may feel guilty, like they did something to deserve it or were responsible for it happening. They might be too young to understand what happened or too young to effectively disclose what occurred. They may have been coerced into keeping the secret by threats from the offender. Also, children don't tell because they may be worried about how others will respond. For example, they may fear that they will get in trouble, won't be believed, will be blamed, or their parents will be mad. They may also feel ashamed about what happened, and they may fear the many changes that will occur if they tell, such as potentially separating the family, sending someone to jail, or having to go through an ongoing legal process. They may fear the disruption this may cause to their family. Another important element of sexual abuse that relates to why children do not tell is grooming. Grooming is a process where perpetrators attempt to gain trust and compliance of a child in order to abuse the child. This includes preparing not only the child but potentially significant adults, family members, and the environment as well. Specific goals include gaining access to the child, gaining the child's compliance, and maintaining the child's secrecy to avoid disclosure. First, the offender develops a relationship with the youth and their family and gains their trust. Offenders may then find opportunities to be alone with the youth. They often make children feel special by giving them gifts, treats, special privileges, or attention. Over time, offenders typically progress from affectionate, non-sexual touches, such as hugging or tickling, to sexual touches. This desensitizes the child to touch. After the sexual abuse, offenders often threaten the child, including that the offender might hurt someone or that no one will believe the child if they tell. They often make the child feel as though it's their fault. Not all sexual abuse survivors experience grooming. However, because the majority of children are abused by someone they know and could easily identify, many offenders will use grooming tactics to prevent disclosure. Some people, including family members, friends, other adults, and professionals, will question whether the abuse actually happened. It may be especially difficult to believe when the accused offender is someone close to the family and someone the family trusts. However, the fact is, children rarely lie about being sexually abused. Estimates show that between 96 to 98% of allegations are true. Unfortunately, despite the extremely low rate of false reports, sexual abuse can be difficult to prove in the court of law. Many people, including jurors, assume that there will be physical or medical evidence to scientifically and objectively prove or reject the allegations of sexual abuse. However, during medical exams, most victims do not have physical or medical evidence of the abuse, possibly because of the delay in disclosing. Additionally, most forensic examinations neither confirm or disprove a child's allegation. Thus, relying on these examinations to determine whether someone believes a child is just illogical. Additionally, some people who are skeptical fear that children make up abuse and these false allegations will cause significant negative effects for the alleged offender. Again, youth rarely make up false allegations of sexual abuse, and no matter the circumstance, any disclosure or suspicion of child abuse should be reported to the police or the child abuse hotline. From there, highly trained forensic interviewers use legally sound procedures to gather precise information in an unbiased manner. Many efforts are in place to ensure interviewers are not suggestive and to minimize the need for repeated interviews. Some may not believe a child's report of sexual abuse if they are not exhibiting any emotional or behavioral problems. For example, people may begin to doubt that sexual abuse occurred if the child generally is acting normal rather than highly distressed. Or people may not believe a child if they are not emotionally reactive when talking about or reporting the abuse. People may believe a child fabricated or made up the abuse because the child is able to talk about it in a neutral manner without crying, becoming upset, displaying fear, or showing strong emotions. However, studies show that children are just as likely to exhibit relaxed or neutral emotions and behaviors when reporting abuse as they are negative emotions. Thus, it's important to believe a child regardless of their emotional expression or regardless of their emotional or behavioral state. You cannot tell if a child has been sexually abused just by looking at them, especially by just observing their emotions and behaviors. Believing a child's disclosure shows support, empathy, and protectiveness. Also, believing a child's report ensures appropriate access to treatment and services, all of which can have important implications for the youth's recovery. Following the news of child sexual abuse, a common response is to blame the victim for the abuse. This includes non-offending parents, family members, and other adults close to the child. This may be surprising to many, yet significant research demonstrates that people perceive youth as having contributed to their victimization. Certain children are more likely to experience blame from others. For example, older children, like adolescents, are more likely to be blamed for experiencing sexual abuse compared to younger children. Also, males tend to place blame onto child sexual abuse victims more than females. Youth who are blamed for their abuse may experience worse outcomes. For example, blaming the child may prompt the child to self-blame and internalize responsibility. Also, when those close to the youth blame them, it may be expected that they also are not appropriately providing support and compassion to the child. Many non-offending parents of sexual abuse victims are also sometimes blamed for the abuse. Blaming non-offending parents can also be harmful. Parents may already be experiencing distress and feelings of guilt, and being blamed by others could intensify these feelings. Because of the many harmful outcomes associated with sexual abuse, as well as the strong emotional distress adults may be feeling when they hear about the sexual abuse, many people fear that the child will never be the same, is ruined, or is permanently damaged. However, as discussed earlier, many children do return back to the level of functioning they were at before the abuse occurred, especially when treatment and other protective factors are in place. While it is not uncommon to hold negative expectations for the child due to the sexual abuse, doing so can have adverse repercussions. For example, believing a child is now permanently damaged or expecting poor outcomes reduces optimism and the hope or prospect for resiliency. Increasing resiliency and abolishing the damaged child mentality or outlook should be a priority for all adults interacting with children who have experienced sexual abuse. Additionally, expecting the child to experience emotional or behavioral problems can impact how one interacts with the child. This can then encourage the child to behave in ways that match the negative expectation, similar to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Overall, expecting a child will experience highly negative symptomology following sexual abuse can have harmful effects on the child. In review, we hope you learned the definition and prevalence of child sexual abuse, the vast array of outcomes associated with victimization, the factors related to better outcomes for survivors, and the common responses people have to child sexual abuse disclosures and how people's responses may influence child outcomes. Throughout this training, it was our goal to promote and empower all adults and all professionals to be a positive part of survivors' recovery. We hope you found this information valuable. Please click the arrow to go to the next slide. To finish the remainder of this study, exit this window and return to the Qualtrics survey.